So we've taken a deep dive into step 1, writing hypotheses, and step 6, writing conclusions. And now we want one more deep dive in section 10.1, and it's a very important one. And it's into step 2, but it's a little hidden from us. It's going to be getting into what is alpha, that Greek letter that looks like a little fish that we've been seeing for a couple chapters now. And how does that deal with a type 1 error, and what the heck is a type 1 error? Okay, so let's go back and think about our possibilities. So when we look at the hypothesis test, there are two actual situations that could be true. It could be that H naught is truly actually true, or it could be that H naught is false, which by the way would mean that H1 is true, because those are your only two options. Okay, but that's actual reality. Real life, we don't get to know reality most of the time. Right? So in reality, this is what's really, really, truly going on. Okay, but we don't make a decision based on reality. We make a decision based on evidence, right? So we decide, and actually I should change this. It's really more a decision that we're making, right? So the decision we're making is to either reject or not reject the null hypothesis, right? Because those are the only two options available to us, is to either reject or not reject. So if we decide to reject the null hypothesis, right, then, and the null hypothesis was true, that's a correct decision. So let's think back to our dice example from the very beginning of the class, or this section, I should say. One second. So we assumed when we picked up the dice out of the box that P is equal to 1/6, that the proportion is 1/6, that the dice are fair. Right? And so if all we have is these data right here that you can see on the screen, you'd be like, yep, dice are fair. I'm not going to reject the null hypothesis. Seems good, right? And that would be a correct decision, right? Or at least so you think, right? Because if you'll remember, we have Andrea sneaking up there into the 0 group. So it's possible that you didn't reject H naught, but you should have, because she was in there with a not 1/6 die. She had a die that didn't have a 5 on it. So her P was not equal to 1/6, but you couldn't catch her in that. So that would be a type 2 error. So let me scroll back to the errors real quick. There we go. So we made the decision not to reject the null hypothesis, right? So we're saying, yep, dice are fair. And that, if Andrea was in the class, that would have been a type 2 error, because the dice were actually not fair, but we didn't catch it because her dice was sneaky, right? Now, let's suppose the other thing happens and we reject the null hypothesis. We're saying, nope, the dice aren't fair, right? And that would be the other student, Steve, that gave us that evidence. Real quick, let me scroll back to that. There he is. So he's got that 12 down there, which I hid on the last discussion part. So if you have that 12, if you have that student in there, you're thinking, oh, dice aren't fair. Nope, right? I've got evidence that the dice are not fair. So I'd reject that null hypothesis. I reject that P is equal to 1/6. Well, it's possible that's completely correct, but it's also possible that that's not correct and we're making a wrong decision. Because if the dice actually are fair and Steve was just lying to us, or Steve just made it up, right, then we just made a type 1 error, right? Now, if his results were actually true and the dice were not fair, or we somehow spotted Andrea and her die not being fair, then rejecting that null hypothesis is a correct decision. So think about what this means. This means every time we run a hypothesis test, this huge process all through chapters 10, 11, and beyond if we go beyond, there's always 4 options. There's always 4 possible things that could be going on, right? If we reject the null hypothesis, we could be making a correct decision, or we could be making a type 1 error. If we do not reject the null hypothesis, we could be making a correct decision, or we could be making a type 2 error. All right, so the dice example is fine, but it's a little, hard to kind of remember how that all works. So let's give ourselves another example, which is the criminal justice system in America. So in America, in the U.S. criminal legal system, according to the Constitution, the null hypothesis, the thing that is assumed to be true unless we can prove it otherwise, according to the Constitution, is that you are innocent unless we can prove, quote unquote, that you are guilty. Of course, in this class, we're sort of learning that you can never really prove anything, but you can prove that something is reasonable to assume. Right? In other words, we gather evidence for something. Okay, so there are my null and alternative hypotheses. The null is that the person is innocent. The alternative is that the person is guilty. Okay, now let's suppose that we, by magic, actually know the real situation. Now this is by magic because in real life we don't get to know this, right? So, but you just kind of have to bear with me here for the thought experiment. So we're going to say, hey, I magically know this. I've waved a wand and I've got it. So if an H naught is truly true, then the person is truly innocent. If H naught is truly false, right, H naught is false, that means H1 is true, and that means the person is actually guilty. So let me type that up. Okay, so now those are the actual situations. Now, what are the decisions that we could reach? Well, we could decide to not reject the null hypothesis or to reject the null hypothesis. Now, if we don't reject the null hypothesis, that means we're going to let the null hypothesis stand. So the verdict would be, now I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, well, the verdict should be innocent. But it isn't, not in the US. We say not guilty. Now, why do we say that? Well, what we mean is we still think you did something, but we didn't have the evidence to prove it, right? It's the equivalent of like, there could still be a type 1 error. I don't trust you. Right? So that's your verdict. So your verdict is not guilty. If we reject the null hypothesis, we're rejecting that innocence. So that would mean that the verdict would become back guilty. But of course, it's possible that either one of those verdicts is incorrect. All right, now let's start with the correct decisions. So in this corner up here, this is a correct decision because you're letting an innocent person go free. And hypothetically speaking, that's a good thing, right? So the innocent person is let go, everybody is happy, there you have it. Now the bottom right corner is also a correct decision because that is a defendant that was guilty being found guilty. I've got a smiley face on that. It's not necessarily a happy thing, but at least the system is working as we intended to. Of course, provided that the laws are evenly applied and such. All right, now that leads us to the other two corners. So what do they look like? So let's start over here in the top right. This is the verdict is not guilty, but the defendant truly is guilty. Right? So that's a type 2 error. I gave it a frowny face. So there are lots of examples of this. My favorite is, of course, all the comic book and soap opera villains. Now, granted, some of them escape from prison, but a lot of them are the legal system doesn't catch them and stuff like that. Al Capone also was famous, of course, for escaping conviction for a lot of things until they finally got him on tax evasion. He was put away for life somehow for tax evasion, which is not a normal sentence for that, but of course it's because everybody knew that he was a mobster. All right, so that would be a guilty person set free, type 2 error. That's bad, obviously, because that guilty person might go on to commit more crimes, further terrorize the citizenry, etc. Okay, now we also have this one, which is a guilty person, a guilty verdict for a truly innocent person. Oh, that's not good either. And I'm sorry to say that there are tons and tons and tons of examples of this. Every time I teach this class, invariably sometimes I actually gave up on it, but I used to have on the discussion boards for the online class, students could post an article, and it just got so long because every student could find a different article than every other student of some innocent person that was wrongfully convicted. As a matter of fact, there's a project running out of the U of M, University of Michigan Law School. Jackson College is an hour from University of Michigan, so it's called the Innocence Project. So law school students will devote their time getting falsely convicted people exonerated. And of course, there's many movies about this. One of my favorites is The Shawshank Redemption, starring Tim Roberts and Morgan Freeman. It's very good, but a man was wrongfully convicted of a crime he did not commit. There's also the movie and television show The Fugitive, which are kind of more old school. So those would be examples of this. It is not just in fiction, however. It actually has happened lots and lots and lots. There are several documentaries about it, and also there's the Innocence Project information there.